We are so excited to welcome Joshunda Sanders, author of Women of the Post. You might remember her from our Flash Fiction America anthology last March. She read a gorgeous piece for us then. This is her debut historical novel. The book tells the story of the African American women of the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion in the Women's Army Corps. They were posted in England to sort millions of pieces of mail during World War II. A Bronx native, Joshunda is the author of several books, most recently Women of the Post from Park Row Books this summer. She serves as a Hedgebrook alumni ambassador and has been the recipient of writing residencies, fellowships, or awards from the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, Lambda Literary, Bronx Council on the Arts, Hedgebrook, VONA, and the Key West Literary Seminars. In 2018, she was awarded the competitive Bronx Recognizes Its Own Award for Excellence in Fiction. In the summer of 2019, her first children's book, I Can Write the World, featuring Ava Murray, a Black girl journalist from the Bronx, was published by 6 Foot Press. Her previous publications include How Racism and Sexism Killed Traditional Media, Why the Future of Journalism Depends on Women and People of Color, a novella, All City, and a memoir, The Beautiful Darkness, a handbook for orphans. Joshunda is also the Senior Executive Communications Officer to the President and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Please note that all of our Brown Bag Lit readings are free, but we do hope that you will buy the author's books. Welcome, Joshunda. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's joining during the lunch hour on a rainy, in some places, Friday. It's great to be here. It's great to be with Brown Bag Lit again.
So if you would like to read from the beginning of the book to set us up, and then I have some questions and we'll keep the chat open and folks can ask questions at any time there or raise their hands here.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to start off, to ground folks in the book and its concept, like Shasta was mentioning, the book is focused on the 688, which was a group of 855 Black women who served as part of the Women's Army Corps. And it was actually really the only part of the Army or the military that was starting to integrate. This is before large scale integration in the US military. And Black women, by and large, weren't allowed to serve overseas. That was an assignment that was reserved for white women. But it took a lot of advocacy on behalf of Black presses and advocates like Miranda Bethune to actually change that. But the novel opens with one of the main characters, Judy Washington. She is the protagonist. She is on the Bronx slave market with her mother, Margaret. And there's been a piece, this is based on a real life piece, by Marvel Cook, who's a journalist in New York, and Ella Baker, the famous SNCC civil rights activist, they've sort of gone undercover on the Bronx slave market, which is this open air market for domestic workers in New York City at a time when the immigration of European domestic workers was not allowed. It was sort of discouraged, I guess, during the war. And so there was this sort of missing gap for domestic workers in New York City. And so sort of to keep up middle class appearances, there were white women in the Bronx and also throughout the rest of New York City who would hire Black women at very low wages and sometimes steal even money from them in order to sort of have their houses clean. It's like 10 cents an hour, 5 cents an hour kind of thing. So Judy has written a letter at the start of the novel, and sort of talked about why it's so important for her to see this piece of journalism. And she's really looking now for an opportunity to do something else, something that some dignified work that will set her family up. Since the men went to war, there was never enough of anything for Judy and her mother, Margaret, which is how they came to be three Negro women relegated to one of the dozens of so-called slave markets for domestic workers in New York City. For about 2 years now, her husband Herbert had been overseas. She was one half of a twin, her best friend from high school, and her first and only dog, if you could call it that. Judy had moved with her parents from the overcrowded Harlem tenements to the South Bronx midway through her sophomore year of high school. She was an only child. Her father, James, doted on her in part because he and Margaret had tried and tried when they were back home in the South for a baby. But Judy was the only one who made it, stayed alive. He treasured her, called her a miracle. Margaret would cut her eyes at him, complain that he was making her soft. The warmth Judy felt at home was in stark contrast to the way she felt at school, where she often sat alone during lunch. When they were called upon in classes to work in groups of 2 or 3, she excused herself and asked for the wooden bathroom path, so that she often worked alone instead of facing the humiliation of not being chosen.
Joshunda, can I
Yes.
interrupt for one moment? It's a little hard to hear. I wonder if it's the headphones. It was a little easier before.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I hate interrupting.
Do you
But I
want
want to
me
make sure.
to just use the computer microphone? Is that what you're saying?
I think that sounds clearer.
Does it sound clearer to everybody else?
Would anyone
Okay.
like? No. Okay.
All right. I can
All right,
also
thank you.
just, like,
I'm really sorry.
yes. Oh, sure. No problem. I'll just also speak up, use my Bronx girl voice. Sometimes I can mumble and I'm not trying to. So thank you for that. When they were called upon in classes to work in groups of 2 or 3, she excused herself and asked for the wooden bathroom pass so that she often worked alone instead of facing the humiliation of not being chosen. She had not grown up with friends, and nor had Margaret, so it almost felt normal to live mostly inside herself this way. There were girls from the block who looked at her with what she read as pity. Nice skirt, Logan say, almost reluctantly. Thanks, she'd say, a little shy to be noticed. Mother made it. Small talk was more painful than silence. How had the other Negro girls managed to move with such ease here after living almost exclusively with other Negroes down in Harlem? Someone up here was as likely to have a brogue accent as a Spanish one. She didn't mind the mingling of the races, it just was new, a shock to the system, both in the streets she walked to go to school and to the market, but also in the halls of Mars High School. Judy had been eating an apple, her back pressed against the cafeteria wall, when she saw Herbert. He was long-faced, with a square jaw and round, black W.E.B. Du Bois glasses. That's all you're having for lunch? It's no wonder you're so slim, he said, like he was continuing a conversation they had been having for a while. Rich coming from him, with his lanky gait, his knobby knees pressing against his slacks. A pile of assorted foods rose from his blue tray, tantalizing her. A sandwich thick with meat and cheese and lettuce, potato chips off to the side, a sweating bottle of Coke beside that. For years, they had all lived so lean that it had become a shock to suddenly see some people making up for lost time with their food. Judy finished chewing her apple and gathered her skirt closer to her. You offering to share your lunch with me? Herbert gave her a slight smile. Surely you didn't think all this was for me. And they were fast friends after that. It was easy for her to make room for a man who looked at her without pity. There had always been room in her life for someone like him, one who saw, who comforted, who provided. Her father, James, grumbled disapproval when Herbert asked support, but Herbert came with sunflowers and his father's moonshine. What kind of man do you take me for? James asked, eyeing Herbert's neat sun tie, sniffing sharply to inhale the obnoxious musk of too much aftershave. A man who wants his daughter to be loved completely, Herbert said, the way that I love her. Their courting began. Judy had no other offers and didn't want any. That they had James's blessing before he died from a heart attack, and just as they were getting ready to graduate from high school, only softened the blow of his loss a little. As demure and to herself as she usually was, burying her father turned Judy more inward than Herbert expected. In his death, she seemed to retreat into herself the way that she had been when he approached her that lunch hour. To draw her out, to bring her back, he proposed marriage. She balked. Can I belong to someone else? Judy asked Margaret, telling her that Herbert asked for her hand. I hardly feel like I belong to myself. This is what women do, Margaret said immediately. The ceremony was small, with a reception that hummed with nosy neighbors, stopping over to bring slim envelopes of money to give to the bride of her mother. The older Negro women in the neighborhood, who wore the same faded floral house dresses as Margaret, except for today when she put one of her two special dresses on, the radiant sky blue, that made her amber eyes look surrounded in bold light, visited her without much to say, just dollar bills folded in their pockets, slipped into her grateful hands. They were not exactly her friends. She worked too much to allow herself leisure, but some of them were widows too. Like her, they had survived much to stand proudly on days like this. They settled into the plans they made for their life together. He joined the reserves and in the meantime became a Pullman porter. Judy began work as a seamstress at the local dry cleaner. Whatever money they didn't have, they could make up with rent parties until the babies came. Now all of that was on hold, her life suspended by the announcement at the movies that the U.S. was now at war. The news was hard enough to process, but Herbert's status in the reserves meant that this was his time to exit. She braced herself when he stood up to leave the theater and report for duty, kissing her goodbye with a rushed press of his mouth to her forehead.
Beautiful. Thank you. Really. Well, I don't want to give anything away about their relationship, but so I was so interested in so many parts, but the history and how you were able to weave through so many components. I have a list of questions here, but thinking about, I'm really curious about the choices that you made to choose the different women's point of view, and then to weave the letters in back home with the families, the mothers in particular. Since Brown Bag Lit is primarily a community of writers working on books and reading avidly and thinking about how they were constructed and enjoying them, I was kind of wondering about your thought process about how you decided to create this structure.
Yeah, so this structure actually took a really long time to come together. I've written, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 drafts before I worked with my agent actually to sort of reimagine what would work best. There were no letters really, or there were a few letters in the original drafts, but the focus was really on Judy, and everybody else was a secondary character. Even Lieutenant Charity Adams, who was a real person, and took some liberties with the details of her personal life, but for the most part, a lot of the details of Charity's character come from her memoir of One Woman's Army. And there were no real letters in that either, but because the motto for the 6888 is no meal, no morale, it made a lot of sense to me to begin sorting out the characterization of Judy, of Charity, and Mary Alice, who's the third main character in the book, through letters, right? And to me, letters have always been super important. One, I'm a person who keeps a journal. I've been keeping a journal since 1992. Which makes me feel like I'm 1,000 years old. When I say, whenever you mention the 90s, it's like, oh my God, that was such a long time ago. And so anyway, but yeah, and I used to have a pen pal, and I still have stamps. I still have envelopes that I very rarely use. And speaking of things that make you feel like, Methuselah. And so I understood and loved the intimacy of a direct communication from one person to another. And I think that it's a wonderful way for you to begin to understand what people care about, right? Because especially in this day and age, everything, all the communication that we get is instantaneous. But we were talking a little bit about, this before the session, but it takes a certain amount of patience and patience to wait for the communication, and endurance, but also to write the communication, you have to prioritize, especially back then and during the war, with female and all of that, you had to really shorten and emphasize the things that they thought were important. So a letter is like a really, an epistolary form in a way is like sort of my natural habitat, for all these reasons, but for these characters in particular, I thought it was a great way to introduce the people in their lives, the things that they were thinking about, their inner lives, which are missing largely from the archive in American history, like the inner lives of Black women are just missing. And so it also provided this sort of creative opportunity and exercise for me to begin to imagine some of what was missing.
Yeah, it's a love letter to the letter and this communication. And I love the arc with some of, I won't say too much, but some of the characters writing to their families and their mothers and one father, and how there's sort of a sense of forgiveness and acceptance and understanding who they are as people, how they're changing, and then how the two landscapes back home are changing, and then in Europe. I was really taken by two places about the mail. If you would kindly read on page 180, let's see, I think it's toward the bottom after the letter to Frank, these emotional letters down to the end of the first paragraph on 181 about what a letter is. I thought that was a really beautiful passage, if you would like.
Oh yeah, so after the Frank letter,
Yes.
to the top of 81, or just to the bottom of 180.
Oh, maybe to the bottom of 180.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
These emotional letters made her think about home, about her first days in the WAC, the really good parts of finally making it to the Army. She had been able to share that with Ethel and Betsy, something to be thankful for. This is Mary Alice. She had been saving up descriptions of Iowa and their drills and her time in the officers club to paint the picture for Helen, who's her mother. But now there was no one to send an update to, and she wished she had someone to write to about her situation, about her mom. Reading the heartfelt words of others in those letters also gave her more time to think about what a letter meant. The way it gave you tangible proof that someone loved you enough to find the time and the materials to write down their thoughts and feelings about you. The demonstration of affection or love in sentence form, sent by plane or ship to wherever you were.
And that magic of the letter appearing, especially then, before obviously the internet and phones and everything, is really beautiful. And so many of us have the inclination, like you were saying, that you keep a journal, to write all the time, but non-writers often don't. So it takes even more to write that letter and to put those thoughts and be so specific about what they want to say and send that home. And then on page 170, you talk about the victory mail, which I thought was really interesting. I think if you could maybe start reading from, if it's all right, toward the bottom of 170, battle activity on international waters, and then through the first full paragraph on 171. I thought that was an interesting part about the history.
Yeah, so battle activity on international waters meant standard mail could take up to a month to deliver. Victory mail, also called D-mail, took half that time because it consisted of a one-page filmed document with a serial number and a space for a censor's stamp of approval so that no compromising details about the war could fall into the wrong hands. Single sheets of V-mail stationery had room for about 300 to 600 words and were available at 5 and dime stores. The advantage of V-mail was that the military could track it easily and move it faster since it weighed less than standard mail. The process of handling mail from a soldier overseas to loved ones at home added in 2 steps. A unit censor blacked out operational or tactical details, overly descriptive mentions of maneuvers and other sensitive details before the letter made its way back to the APO and the postal regulatory station. Then, before the mail was shipped, a post censor checked the same letter to make sure nothing compromising had made it through the first. Like, they were serious. Like, they were like, "You mean censorship? Like, we actually are going to censor it a lot."
So many layers. I put some links in here from the National World War II Museum and the Postal Museum where you can see some of the victory mail. I've really enjoyed looking at the tangible objects. And I think Shasta has a question about the history.
I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about doing research. I know you did quite a lot of research for this, and in balancing what you found with the story that you wanted to tell, and how you kind of avoid, if you were able to avoid, the rabbit hole of research. I know some of us can get so focused on the research, right, that like you forget that you're actually having, like, you need to write something, right? It's like two different kind of hats. I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about the process and balancing it.
Yeah, so I love research, and if it were up to me, I would just research. I would have just researched and researched until someone told me to stop, which has to happen because you do have to write the book. But you know, I think for me the balance was, sort of sorting out the details that I needed to be faithful to in order to satisfy the narrative and plot arcs. And also recognizing that, like, the realities of what Black women could do and where they could travel and how they were actually permitted to move around in the military were also a kind of fiction, even though, and what I mean by that is there's so much research about World War II, and there's so many books, and there's so much history out there, but it's all really focused on men. It's predominantly focused on white men. And so there's been increasingly more about Black men in the military, but there's very little written about Black women. So, so the limitations of my research really were that I understood that on some level I was just going to have to make up a ton about Black women and just imagine what I was really researching to find gaps, right? To find sort of in this Venn diagram that does not include Black women, where would they fit, right? Because there's even very little written about white women, for that matter, in World War II. And so beginning to see sort of when they would enter the history became sort of the main focus of my research. And the rest of it was all just sort of educational context for myself, just like not having known that there was a women's Army Corps, not understanding sort of how that structure mirrored or didn't, regular US military history. And then also trying to understand the attitudinal context, like how people in society were thinking about these women and their service. And yeah, I mean, so for me, the balance was, okay, I need to know enough. I'm never going to be a World War II expert, but I need to know enough about World War II and who was there so that I can write about who has not really shown up in history or historical narratives about World War II. And then figure out, like, what is the addition? Like, not only am I elevating the 688, as a few others have done, but in the Women's Army Corps and also the Bronx slave market on top of that. But why? So research couldn't really answer the why, but it could just really answer the contextual piece of, like, what was going on. I don't think it can answer the question of why the histories have been sort of suppressed or ignored, or I think that's just a broader societal question. But yeah, I think it did help me to understand what the connections could have been throughout history and what they would be in this particular story.
I think you do a great job of showing us their lives in the US, how difficult it is in different communities, and then how the Jim Crow laws follow them to Europe when they are also doing the work and risking their lives. And from that first moment when they're on the ship and then they hear the bombs, and they're in danger and they're in the war. I mean, even if they're sorting mail, it's not that they're completely safe and somewhere separate. They're in the place of the bombings. They're in London and in danger, and then also in danger from their fellow service people who are white and judging them and asking to keep them separate, and then their work to make their own space and be comfortable and care for one another while dealing with so many extra layers of terror and fear and distance and difficulties. I wanted to also ask you if you could read on page 168. I think I was really struck by toward the top of 168 when I think it's Charity is speaking to the women and noting why they're there and what they're carrying with them, that it's not just an individual challenge or a challenge for America, but rather for the African American women themselves. So if you wouldn't mind reading that top full paragraph on page 168.
Yeah, you got it. I was smiling at you because this is the most thorough, exact pinpointing of the moments that I love in the novel to date. And the book has been out since July. So I'm like, yes, I'm ready. I remember that passage. I remember writing that. That was really fun. Okay. Yes, I know it is a daunting amount of mail, but there was a lot of sweat and sacrifice and petitioning to bring you here to fulfill this important mission. And if we do well here, your reputation will follow you and Negro women for generations in your life. If you fail to excel here, you will sever the ties of approximately 3 million enlisted men from their loved ones. You will snuff out the little bit of home within them that remains.
Yeah, I mean, the weight that they're carrying for themselves, for the African American men, for America is just such, they're making so many large sacrifices and challenges, and they're representing so much as they're there showering outside. I mean, I really enjoyed all these tactile details of how difficult it was to be there and how different, and Bernadette and these kind of different ways of living in the United States, what it means to be a woman and to be comfortable or uncomfortable in this time of war in order to do the work. All right, so we talked about the male, we've talked about African-American female experience, right? We're zooming through all of these big issues. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about your drafts and the agent. So what was the draft like that you first submitted to let me back up. First, was the agent already your agent, or did you get the agent for this book?
No, I love that question because I learned a ton about publishing and the publishing industry and the business of publishing through publishing this book, particularly as a debut novelist in my 40s, that I just would not have known. So I had originally an agent for the children's books that I've worked on, and we parted ways during the pandemic. And I had to sort of re-query to find like sort of the right agent for this particular project. And so I really lucked out and connected with an agent who really loves historical fiction. My agent is Elizabeth Reed at the book group. And that really made a huge difference, not only because Elizabeth and the book group they're really smart women and they really know the business and they really understand. They have great relationships with editors and they understand how to position things, but they also are sort of hands-on in the editorial process in terms of shaping things before they make it to editors in the process of editors selecting a book and a project for purchase. And so I initially submitted. Well, first of all, I have a writing friend that I met at Hedgebrook who read the early pages and read the draft when it was like 450 pages. And it had all these men in it. And she basically was like, who are these guys? And I was like, I don't know. It's a historical fiction book. So I had to write the full history of everybody like in the neighborhood. And she was like, yeah, you can't. Does it, like had all this stuff about like, Judy's father, because he had served in the wars and that she was going to serve in the war, that it was a thing. And so it just was like too much. So she helped me actually like make it a readable manuscript that was like, didn't have an entire family tree and lineage in it. And really focused more on Judy and her mom initially. And so the draft that I submitted to Elizabeth, when I queried her, had some focus on Judy and Margaret in the Bronx League market. It didn't really draw out the characters or their points of view. So it wasn't broken up in the way that it is now. So now it's like, you know, it has 3 points of view, 3 main characters, and narrative arcs really for all of them, in addition to the overarching narrative arc. And so that was something that she and I came up together with in the process of drafting.
So it's amazing how much it's changed. I think we often think that we submit a book to an agent the way that it's supposed to be, and then it's done. But it was obviously strong enough that she wanted it, but she also wanted some edits and changes to continue strengthening it and then know how to try and sell it.
Yeah, I can't even remember how many drafts it was, honestly, but like it always tickled me too, because I think I had this idea as a younger writer too, that you just like will submit something and then it's done and you can just go publish it. Which I'm sure everyone here knows, like the complete fantasy and fallacy of that. But I would like write a new draft, and I would spend, you know, my weekends and my holidays, and I would just be like rewriting it and revising it. And I'm like, this is great. This is the one. Like, she's going to be satisfied, and she'd be like, okay, that's lovely. And now here's another complete change that I would like you to make. And I think we need to gut this whole part and start over, and then add a whole bunch of things here. And I'd be like, no, it's done. This is the 8th time, you know, but it's like, it's fine. It's like, you know, I know she knows the market. She understands the relationship. She understands editors and what they're looking for. And also plot points, you know, like I feel like I've read Save the Cat and everything about beat sheets like 20 times. I still don't understand it, even though I watch all the movies all the time, whenever I'm not writing or reading. I'm like, why don't I understand plot? Like, why don't I know how to make an inciting incident happen? Is this act 3? Am I in act 2? Like, where am I in this story?
I feel so much better about myself in life.
I was like, why can't I understand Save the Cat? Why is everybody telling me?
This book I thought was going to solve all of my problems. So I have a very editorial agent as well, and she gave me like a 15-page letter after she took me on. And then I read this and I was like, I totally fixed it. I fixed it. And she was like, you made it worse.
No,
So
I mean, all of
this book.
I know, I took all the beats, right? And I wrote them out on index cards. Because, you know, like, I forget, like Ava DuVernay or somebody like said this, right? That when they were plotting out a movie or a film or whatever, they just like had index cards and put them. So I'm like out here, like looking like a crazy person. I'm like, I hope no one comes in this apartment and sees what I have going on. It's become the Unabomber. But like, I just have all these little index cards with like act 2, act 3, and it was wild.
Yeah, I still don't understand how to do an inciting incident. I don't understand what the acts are.
I think we just have to practice, you know? Like, I was like, I literally just in a Word doc, act 1 in all caps, act 2, act 3. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna put some stuff in bullets, and then we'll see. We will move the bullets around over time.
Oh my God, I love that so much.
And you divided it into 3 pieces.
Exactly.
3 parts.
That was my Save the Cat nod. Hats off to Save the Cat for helping me with the 3-act structure. Because I was like, oh, we can just I'll do everything in 3. It's gonna make my life easier.
Yeah. We have a question from Amanda in the chat. I worked as an undergrad at the Sophia Smith Collection, a women's history archive at Smith College, and read many unpublished letters from the 19th and 20th centuries. It strikes me that letters require more careful focus on the use of language. How difficult was it, if it was, to write a historic idiom?
Yeah, I love that question. I don't know that I understood a lot. First of all, I didn't think that I was writing historical fiction. I didn't know that it was a thing. And I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that now. I went to the History Book Festival and like You know, there's just like a whole world of historical fiction that is new to me, and that I really enjoy, because I love history and I love fiction, so it makes a lot of sense. But you know, I in early drafts of the novel, I I had these sort of contemporary notions. So there's a fella that Judy meets when she's overseas, and the way that she was sort of flirting with him was a real. It was like some Tinder, you know, like it wasn't that overt, but it was more like, you know, something that would happen in the aughts, you know, not something that would happen like in the 1940s. And my agent was really like, you gotta remember that she's like married, and like, you know, she wouldn't like touch his arm, you know. I'm like, oh, that's right. Because like people were like more decent in the olden days, you know. And we're just out here, you know, like Jezebels, I guess. And so I was like, right, let me like pull that back. And then, but it was the same with language too, right? There were things that people would say and ways that they would put things, just like there were really specific like kinds of cakes and casseroles and things that people ate, that just wouldn't even occur to me now. So it was difficult to think about and to imagine the proper context of how people would communicate with each other, and also to think about the priorities for someone like Charity Adams writing to her father, who's a preacher in North Carolina, who's sort of this dignified, you know, man in town, at the same time that he is under siege by the Ku Klux Klan, and also just, you know, the threat of danger is always imminent for him in a different way than it is for her. And so I also think about, I think one of the harder things for me to think about is what people would conceal, what they might leave out, because we know that as intimate as letters can be, they are also performative, right? Like they're like anything else. You make those choices about what you'll tell your parents, and what you think might make them run screaming toward a ship headed in your direction.
I was on that kind of note toward the end in the author's note, you mention what you decided to fictionalize, what you took from history, considering the people, not just the situation. I think those sound like really hard choices about which historic character, maybe it's just based on what research is available, but who to choose and then who to make up. And you describe nicely in the author's note why you made up certain characters in order to show certain parts of, I hate the word society, but kind of the larger society, expectations and relationships. Can you talk about a little bit about why you decided to choose certain characters who were historical?
Sure. So Charity Adams is a no-brainer. I mean, I think she's starting to get wider recognition, which makes me really happy. I think there's now an army base that's named after her. In fact, I think, you know, the 688 now has seen Congressional Gold Medal. I think she was particularly starting to get more decorated at the end of her life. And so to me, and also so many of the details that shape really the heart of the book, and what we know about the 688 came from her memoir, One Woman's Army, including the character of Mary Alice, who is sort of named for the real life woman who was a 106-year-old woman named Alice Dixon, or Alice, who changed her name. And she is the reason that I found out about the 688. And so it's like just looking for some respite from political news and found her obituary. And that's how I learned about the Women's Army Corps, and also how I first learned about the 688. And so, so I wanted a character that was named after Alice, but with that particular spelling of Alyce. But really the impetus for that character is also based on a real life sort of anonymous recruit that is mentioned in Charity Adams' memoir. So she mentions this who comes to the army thinking that she needs more grace, but then points out who she thinks she is. And so, so yeah, I mean, for really practical reasons, Charity Adams is one of the main characters, and everyone else is sort of a composite.
And they were awarded, am I right, that this spring, I think they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for their work. I think it was the spring.
Yeah, I think it was fairly recent.
And I'm going to put these two Smithsonian Magazine links into the chat. So I was really struck on page 291. So now we're kind of at toward the end of the book, where Charity receives a letter from her father, who's a Reverend E.A. Adams. And you write, he's talking about them coming home, that the war has ended. On the matter of Jim Crow, we are not as changed as we would hope. Our country is the same, possibly worse off for the example set by the Nazis. When it comes time for you to come home, you'll need to be mindful that lots of Negroes have been killed for wearing uniforms in public. And I think this was a really striking moment of thinking of all that had changed, what the women had done, and all that hadn't changed. And you draw in a couple of places that I can't reference exactly in this moment, the moments where you mention how the Nazis and Mussolini were learning from Jim Crow and segregation and slavery in the United States, and vice versa. In the United States, learning perhaps from the Nazis and what could happen here, and that fear and that kind of pull that you were talking about, the time periods, and here in the aughts, what's still happening today. And I think the book feels so relevant in this one particular moment, thinking about contemporary history and America and where we are, despite great successes and things that African Americans and folks have done in America and abroad. But it's a really small moment in that it's not the focus of the book, that we're really abroad and we're focused on the women. But what I'm really taken by throughout the book is your accessing of the larger story through the women, and thinking about reading historical fiction and novel and those characters and people that we can hold on to and live through their experiences, versus a textbook or a nonfiction book that I wish to be the person who would read. But it's perhaps harder to understand the humanity of the characters when we get to such larger numbers and we see history from such a distance. And here we're really close in the hearts of the characters and the families, and it really allows us in. So
thank you for saying. Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I mean, I was thinking about fascism, right? Like, because when I read that article about Alice, it was 2017, and we had a new presidential administration, and I was just leaving DC, and really depressed, and sad and afraid. DC had just already started to change dramatically, and I think that happens across administrations and when there's a shift in power. But the Holocaust Museum there had started to put out things like a press release saying, the Holocaust didn't begin with killing; it began with words, and it began with language. And we started to really see that language get more specifically undignified and inhumane and divisive. And so thinking about the parallels between that time and this, it was really easy to see those parallels and to feel them. And I didn't want to, in my queries, I was really specific about that. But at the end of the day, in the book, to me, the humanity of the characters felt like the most important thing to bring through. Because if you don't know someone, if you don't feel close to them, then you don't see them as being really a person, right? Like, there's a way in which you can just sort of say that, just stereotype people and really make them the other. if you don't know anything about their lives, you don't really see the connection between their lives and yours. And so that was really my biggest hope for all of these women, particularly the ones who were composites, you know, of all of these women like Judy, like Mary Alice, because, you know, someone like, you know, Charity Ems has her story and has her legend, and I think her mythology will only continue to grow, along with, you know, people just learning more about the truth of who she really was. But you know, for all these other women who didn't have rank and, you know, whose names have been sort of forgotten, or these like footnotes in history, I think it's important for people to know that they lived, that they loved, that they were sisters, that they probably had a lot of fun when they weren't working, you know, that they fell in love, that they got married, that they, you know, made the best of their lives, and that when they return to society, even that they were rewarded in the same way as other veterans, you know, so that this really, you know, that's on us, you know, that is also a legacy in America, that we have allowed it to be so that, you know, their descendants don't have the benefit of generational wealth because they didn't get the benefits of the GI Bill, and they didn't get to have the educational benefits of that. And in fact, Charity Adams worked really hard on that. You know, when she immediately left her active service, she participated with the Department of Veteran Affairs to make sure that more Black women could get those benefits. But, you know, it was a systemic issue, and not something that women really could take on.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of suggestion of all that the women do afterwards as well. If there are more questions, you guys can raise your hands or put something into the chat. I had a really specific question. I'm putting a link in here for the ads that the women saw to enlist in the Women's Army Corps. Is it this image? If you scroll down, was it an image with the white woman and the star and the flag behind, or was there a separate one for African American women, or no?
No, there was just one.
Yeah.
That was the one.
Yeah.
I have a more general question. I'm wondering what you're working on next, and if you would ever write another historical novel.
I am working on a novel that has historical elements to it.
So yes, so you liked the
yes.
I feel like
mean,
it's so daunting. I don't know if we do it again.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between this project and that one is that, like, it was very daunting to write about them, in part because some other people have written about them, and but not the Bronx slave market. And so, like, and then, you know, there's sort of an intimate female friendship sort of queer element in the Women of the Post that is in some of the other books. And so it was daunting for all those reasons. The next project that I'm working on is just more about like the history of place. And so there's so it feels like it's not as fraught and it's not as daunting, because there can be like no survivors who like have feelings about liberties I take with anyone's personal lives or whatever. It just is, yeah, it's just, they're all fictional characters for the most part.
And thinking of the book as an object, when I first saw it, I said, oh, it must already be a movie. It really looks like a movie. How did you come up with the cover, or what happened?
No, so I initially it had a really commercial cover that I really liked. It was like sort of red, white, and blue, and it really kind of popped. It looked more like some of the Harlequin romances that I used to read when I was a kid. Because Harlequin is, you know, the publisher. And so the blurbs from Alice Faulkner and Honore and Jacqueline Woodson, I think elevated sort of the publisher's impression of the book. Not that they didn't think it was going to be a big deal because they obviously had faith in it because they published it, but I think they just were like, oh, huh, yeah, maybe it's not, maybe it's a little bit more literary, maybe it's a little softer, maybe it's a little bit more cinematic. And so they sort of rethought, I think, with the direction of the editor, how they wanted to present it. And I love this much better than the original.
Oh,
It's
that is so interesting. I love getting the inside story to cover. So fun.
Yeah.
Eileen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question just about process, because I'm working on a historical, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. I'm a new writer, and I'm finding the historic challenging. And part of it is you have the story, and then you have all the historic details that you kind of need to make sure you're getting right and plug in. How much I've sort of read a critical mass and I've started writing, but I feel like I don't want to interrupt too much. How was your process iterative? Did you write a lot and then go back and correct and add details? It's adding those atmospherics, I think, are challenging.
Yeah, I was a little bit all over the place because it was my first historical work. And then as sometimes ignorance is bliss. I think it's especially ignorance is especially bliss in the drafting process because the less you know about, like, I sort of hate genre labels. I mean, I'm not a label person anyway, but I thanks, Dorothy. I mainly wanted to detach myself from what had been done before so that I could allow myself to let the draft be what it was, if that makes sense. And so I drafted a whole bunch of wrong military titles, for example, and things not necessarily in the right sequence according to history, but they work for the timeline, for the narrative arc that I needed for the women. Like there are some battles that are happening in Iwo Jima, or the victory in Europe Day, or this, that, and the other. So the timing doesn't quite match up because they were only in service really for like a year and a half at most. But um, but just getting the story on the page as I wanted it to be and as I envisioned it really gave me liberty to go back and revision and add the layers and add the details. And then, in the editing process, you have a copy editor, hopefully someone who has specific expertise in the area of history that you're writing in, who can fact check and, do all that. So like, I would just say for me, it was super liberating to know that like I didn't have to get all the details exactly right. And also that part of historical fiction is that there's a fictional element to it, right? So that there's like, you loosely, these are historical true facts. There are some of these things that are absolutely true. And then some of them have been embellished. So, I think you just have to navigate that balance for yourself in terms of what you're comfortable with.
Thank you.
just have another moment. Could you share something? Oh, Dorothy has a question. Dorothy?
I just wanted to say quickly that I am not a historical fiction fan, as Joshunda knows, and I absolutely love this book and love it so much. As I do with books like this, I struggle finishing them because I don't want to get to the end. So I just wanted to say kudos to Joshunda because this is a historical fiction book that I love. So I guess I can't say I don't like historical fiction anymore.
Thank you so much, Dorothy.
Excellent. This is so beautiful. So if we could, we need to close up. If you could share a book or two that you're currently reading that you love, or something that you kind of inspired you to write this or gave you a structure or an idea, maybe one to three beloved books.
Yeah, so the structure of it in terms of the letters reminded me of how pivotal reading The Color Purple was to me. And Celia's letters to God in particular, and then like correspondence between her and her sister. Just in terms of showing me what's possible, not only for the book form, but The Color Purple has been a novel, it has been a movie, it's been a musical, it is now going to have a second movie that's attached to the musical, right? So like just seeing what is possible for the life of a book is also super inspiring, and thinking about the cinematic art, regardless of what form it's in, and like just how that can transcend the container of a novel. I just finished reading The Unsettled by Ayana Mackis, which is her sophomore novel. It comes out this month. I don't know if it's out yet. It's beautiful. It's a story about a mother and her son in Philadelphia, and also their ancestors in Alabama. But it's sort of contemporary Philadelphia. I was born in Philly, so I have this sort of special connection to the place. And it's just really beautiful.